This next book is probably, I think it's the first book of medical history that I will have reviewed on my channel. And it's by Roy Porter. It's called Madmen, A Social History of Madhouses, Mad Doctors, and Lunatics by Roy Porter. Roy Porter was an English writer who wrote a lot on philosophy, the Enlightenment, especially the English Enlightenment. But one of his real pet subjects was the history of medical science, which he wrote a number of books on. He's mostly known for his books on the history of medicine and the development of medical practice in Europe from mostly modern times, but he stretches back into pre-modern times, into medieval Europe. Madmen, this book, is Porter's attempt of outlining the changes in the care of lunatics, as the subtitle puts it, mostly during Georgian England, so up through about the first quarter of the 19th century. This book traces the different approaches to various mental illnesses from the time of humoralism up until the time of what can be recognized as somewhat modern-day psychiatry in the early 19th century. Porter begins by challenging Michel Foucault's concept of the Great Confinement, in which unreasonable members of society were institutionalized in large numbers. According to Foucault, before the Great Confinement, folly had, quote, a liberty and truth of its own, engaging in a dialogue with reason, end quote, but afterwards became disqualified, abominated, and reduced to pure negation, or unreason. Foucault also maintains that it was mostly the poor who were institutionalized by the rising middle classes. But Porter challenges this as historically inaccurate, at least in England. Instead, progress was slow and gradual, and Foucault has a key contention in the Great Confinement, saying that it was mostly about policing the poor. But Porter points out that it would be a mistake to underestimate the numbers of bourgeois, gentry, and the nobility who were also being confined in relatively large numbers. Porter gives an historical account of the fourfold humoralism. Those are the four bodily substances that were thought to control many aspects of the human personality. They were blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. And he gives an account of these as a way of explaining how rational, mortal people could attain balance with the cosmos. So, basically, if you're healthy, then all of your humors are somehow in balance with the world around you. And etiologies of sickness were also explained as an imbalance between the humors well into the 18th century. Even though there was a medical tendency to somatize mental illness, elements in the culture, including Richard Burton, the author of The Anatomy of Melancholy, and himself a renowned melancholic, portrayed it as a kind of psychomachia, literally a battle between the rational and irrational parts of the soul. And in later Georgian England, insanity became something to be pitied, an idea that was aided by John Locke's conception of madness as a false association of ideas, instead of the overthrow of noble reason by base passions. While confinement of the insane did exist before around 1800, it was in private institutions and sometimes in churches. It wasn't until around after this date that the state began to demand confinement for lunatics in subsidized asylums. Before this, going back even to the Restoration, around the middle of the 17th century, many madhouses were actually private residences. the private houses of doctors. Indeed, that's how even the word madhouse came about, because they were houses, in an age before licensing and state regulation of these facilities. These enterprises could be greatly lucrative for the people running them, of course, since the owners could mandate that the lunatics stay there indefinitely while they collected the money from the lunatics' family members. The Act for Regulating Private Madhouses, an actual name of a piece of legislation of 1774, went some way toward protecting the mentally fit from being wrongly confined, which did actually happen. But they would have to wait until much later, the 1840s, for legislation that attempted to supervise the living conditions and the quality of care that patients actually received in these institutions. During the first part of the 19th century, there grew to be a body of treatments which we can increasingly recognize as psychiatric. Not just medical, but psychiatric. In particular, currents in metaphysics and medicine were proposing fresh paradigms of mind and body, behavior and self, and thereby opening a new field eventually to be denominated the psychiatric. For this, the catalyst proved to be the associated emergence of brick-and-mortar institutions for lunatics. For the presence of the first time of concentrations of patients isolated in madhouses encouraged very close scientific surveillance of delusions and delinquencies, stirring the clinical psychology of the disturbed. This hitherto unparalleled scrutiny of lunatics under controlled conditions, particularly while interacting with supervisors or keepers, formed the matrix for practical and experimental disciplines for managing madness. Much of the book, especially the second half, is sort of bogged down in doctors and case studies of individual patients, which really sort of subtracted from the bigger picture that Porter was trying to paint here. This usually isn't a problem for me, but it was the equivalent of zooming in too close on a photograph and sort of getting that graininess that you can and losing focus of the picture. Had it not been for the minutia that he sometimes focuses in on, I think it could have been a much more effectively done book. But as for the ideas that it presents and the history that it gives of how English society treated the insane, or the lunatics as he calls them, it's a good book. It covers a good deal of history, and it takes you right up through, like I said, the advent of psychiatry, and of course Porter didn't really write much, to my knowledge, on psychiatry at all, but there are certainly other books that you can go to for that. Another one of Porter's books that I really recommend is called The Greatest Benefit to Mankind, The Medical History of Humanity. It's a bit of a long book. It's close to 1,000 pages, but it really is the history of medicine in as concise a form as you can find it. It starts with the ancient Greeks and may go back even further than that and comes up through the modern day. Really something to look into if you're interested in the history of medicine or medical practice. Madmen, A Social History of Madhouses, Mad Doctors, and Lunatics by Roy Porter.